On this episode of What's Going On with Shipping, take my Ukrainian grain, please. I'm your host, Sam Mercaglano. Welcome to this episode of What's Going On with Shipping. If you're new to the channel, take a moment, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell so you'll be alerted about new videos as they come out. Well, a lot of news out there about the fact that Ukraine has started exporting its grain. And I think we need to take a moment and unpack that because while it's true that we've seen quite a few ships start coming out of Ukraine to offload grain, what we're not seeing is a lot of ships going into Ukraine to load grain. And even those that have departed from Ukraine are having issues with offloading that grain that has been stored in the vessels for a long period of time. All right, let's go ahead and jump into this story. So this is a story from Captain Reuters story talking about the first humanitarian ship in Ukraine set to depart for Africa. So a United Nations chartered vessel, the Brave Commander, went in and loaded about 23,000 tons of grain that's destined for Ethiopia. Now, one of the things we did, and we looked at this in a previous video, where we looked at the impact of Ukrainian grain not going out. Again, you can check out that video right up here. Is that the places most hit by the loss of Ukrainian grain is Africa, particularly East Africa. And this element under this Black Sea Grain Initiative, which had been brokered between the United Nations, Turkey, Russia, and Ukraine, opened up basically food lines so that you can start getting shipments of grain out of the Black Sea to countries that need it. And the hope was this was going to open up a basically conduit. And the United Nations, which is working in this, had set up a relief agency that purchased about 800,000 tons of grain in Ukraine last year. And again, this was food that was going out to places that need it. However, what we're seeing here is a bit of problems. Number one, we're not seeing that many vessels head into Ukraine. The number of vessels that are going in are very, very small. And more importantly, there's a question about whether or not there's ability to get more vessels into Ukraine. You got to think about this for a second. Number one, you need a ship that's willing to do it, which means you need to get insurance for that. We'll talk about war risk insurance in a second. You need the crew willing to do it. You need the owner willing to do it. And more importantly, you need to be able to clear customs, the issue of making sure that the vessel is clear to get into Ukraine by Russia. So a lot of hurdles here for getting ships up into Ukraine. But more importantly, the ships that are coming out of Ukraine, these were ships that were stuck in Ukraine since February, are having a hard time. The example here is the first ship that came out, the Sierra Leone flagged vessel, the Razoni. This story, again, on Captain by Reuters, Ukraine's first grain cargo since invasion nears Syria. This cargo was supposed to be going to Lebanon. But the problem is that the Lebanese rejected the cargo. This story right here by Reuters back on August 11th. The Razoni had loaded corn, and that corn had been stuck on the vessel since February. Now, this is a big problem. You can't store grain on vessels for long periods of time without it starting to go bad. And so what we saw here was this ship that was destined for Tripoli in Lebanon wound up not offloading in Tripoli in Lebanon. And instead, what has begun to happen is the vessel went dark. So this ship came out of Mersin off the southern coast of Turkey, and she went dark off AIS a few days ago. August 12th is when she stopped basically broadcasting. One of the best things about Twitter, for those of you who are on there, is if you follow the right people on Twitter, you can learn a lot. So one of the guys I follow on Twitter, an absolute must, is Samir Madani. Samir is a co-founder of an outfit called Tanker Trackers. And this is his this is him right here. And Tanker Trackers does exactly that. It basically tracks tankers, not just through AIS, the transponder signal, but through satellites and a few other methods. And while he doesn't typically track grain vessels, he did hop on this the other day, and all kudos to Sam for this. He posted these tweets and they were just great. And he basically said the same exact thing here. You know, she went offline Wouldn't surprise me in the least if she goes into Syria. The place that she identified as going to was Egypt. Nobody writes Egypt in as their destination. You put a port, you don't just type in Egypt. And it was pretty clear that this vessel went somewhere. And what Sam did was he started looking at satellite images. He was able to pull up a satellite image for that area where she was last reported in. Nope, no sign of her there. But then back on August 13th, found her off the port of Tartus in Syria, where he was able to identify it and actually found a picture of the vessel steaming toward Tartus right there from her last known position when she turned off her AIS. And again, this is a big issue that you can just basically unplug it and go. You're not required to do this, although you can be pinged for this by your insurance and by your flag state. Razoni is flagged in Sierra Leone. They're going to do nothing about this. But then the vessel appeared here off of Syria. But what was really great about this tweet is it generated a whole host of commentary. So Georgios Hatzimanlis, I'm sure I said that wrong, over at Marine Traffic, jumped on board here. Amico Tarazona also got in on this. They had posted a story over here on, Financial Times. Here it is right here, his story, talking about Ukraine's first Black Sea food shipment sails through the Sea of Troubles. One of the things that he identified right here is that there may be some issues with spoilage because the corn, it's a load of corn that's on board this vessel, may have started to spoil. So therefore it wasn't taken. And then there was even more of this going on here with more discussion about it. It was a great little bit of discussion. Following the right people on Twitter is always a good thing because you can actually learn a lot of information very quickly. What has basically become clear here is that the Razoni, when it sailed basically with that Ukrainian grain, the corn, couldn't sell it. Cargo, probably a lot of it has spoiled, wasn't well preserved, but now they're trying to offload it, probably in Syria, which will take it and get that load off there. But the other question you have is what's going on up in Syria itself? Pardon me, what's going on in Ukraine? So this is the Brave Commander, that UN-sponsored vessel. You can see her up against the berth here up in Ukraine. And if we zoom out here a little bit, you'll see exactly where she is. She's in the northern of those three ports in the Gulf of Odessa where she's being loaded. We saw a couple other vessels come in here into the port of Odessa the other day, and they came in. You see right here, these two vessels that came. So you have the Sara here who came in, the Effie, which is a tanker that came in, which came in. So we're seeing some vessels come into the area to begin to offload some of this grain and get it out, but not a lot of movement right now. It's fairly slow. And again, you're not seeing a fairly steady movement out of the Gulf of Odessa like you see, nowhere near to what you see, for example, coming out of the Sea of Azov here for the Russians. And that has a lot to do with some of these stories here. So for example, this story on Lloyd's, Ukraine grain shipment bulker not covered for war risk or cargo. The Razoni, a report done here by Lloyd's, found out that the Razoni did not have war risk insurance on board when it sailed. And so the ship basically, had it struck a mine, had it been hit, would not have been covered for any damages or potential loss of the vessel. Now, unlike cars, you can drive without insurance. You're just taking the risk as the owner for the vessel. And so while this is completely legal, you can do it. Plus, it's not exactly clear who is covering the insurance of the cargo, the P&I insurance on this vessel. And this issue of insurance is a pretty sticky one, I have to tell you, because one of the things that we're going to see here is probably smaller vessels coming in. The vessels we're seeing coming in to Ukraine right now are not the big 50, 60, 70,000 ton bulkers, but the 20 and 30,000 ton bulkers that are older and registered in open registries, and basically the cheaper the vessels. Even the UK, which is provide or Lloyd's, which is handling the war risk insurance, is only covering up to $50 million. And so you're not going to risk large scale vessels coming in, which means that grain coming out of Ukraine by new vessels is not going to be as fast as we've seen in the past. And again, go back to marine traffic, that kind of shows in the evidence here. We're not seeing the steady movement of ships in and out of the ports. Matter of fact, we're still not seeing the movement of some vessels that have been stuck in those ports. And there's probably a couple of reasons for that. Number one, some of those vessels have been decrewed, just caretaker crews on board or no crews at all. So those vessels have got to get restarted. It's not always easy to restart a cold vessel. So there's some money and some issues associated with that. But again, you also have ship owners that are not going to take the risk. Even though we haven't had an issue yet, we know there's floating mines loose in this area. There's always the potential to do it. And grain coming out of Ukraine is a critical issue. It's been a critical issue for a long time. Did a video the other day on the best naval and maritime books of 2021. And one of the books that we identified is this book right here by Nick Lambert, The Warlords and the Gallipoli Disaster: How Globalized Trade Led Britain to the Worst Defeat of the First World War. And you don't typically get books about wheat and grain, but this is a perfect one about that, and how naval strategy came to play in a century ago in trying to open up the Dardanelles and the Bosphorus during the First World War. We're seeing the movement of grain, but very slow, I would argue. Nowhere near the resumption of normal trade. And we still have the potential for that trade to be interdicted. So I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you did, please take a moment, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell so be alerted about new videos as they come out. Give it a thumbs up, leave a comment, share it across social media. And if you can, support the page. By supporting the page, you allow me to take the time and the effort to put these videos together and broadcast them to you. You can support the page in two ways. Number one, you get that super thanks button below and contribute directly to the page, or you can head over to Patreon and become a patron of the page. We have different levels you can join. A little bit goes a long way, hoping to see the page grow and develop over this next coming year. So until the next episode, this is Sal signing off.